Diana Vreeland once declared, "There is no such thing as an elegant American woman. The only exception is Nan Kempner." That sentence was reprinted in magazines, repeated in memorial pieces, and hung over Nan's head like a medal, and also like a sentence. From that moment on, she was no longer allowed to gain weight, dress badly, or fall out of step. The tall, thin, fragile body that Tom Wolfe would call a social X-ray became public property for the New York elite. A moving frame on which any Dior, YSL, or Valentino would hang perfectly like in a textbook. But to keep her position as the only exception, Nan had to pay with her own presence. The real woman was slowly pressed thinner and thinner under the weight of one fashion season after another, jet-set flights, parties she dared not miss. To be called la plus chic du monde, to be hailed by Vanity Fair as the best-dressed clothes horse in the world, she had to accept living in a body that was always on the verge of exhaustion, a thin shadow the world casually referred to as the perfect hanger. In the end, when the Met staged the exhibition, Nan Kempner, American Chic, the clothes were meticulously displayed, but the question, who is Nan beyond these garments, was almost never answered. To be exalted as the ultimate standard, yet remembered as the most famous clothes horse in the world, is that glory or tragedy? To see the answer clearly, it helps to step away from the faceless mannequins in the Met's galleries, away from Andy Warhol's 1973 silkscreen portrait with its flat blocks of color and half-smile, and wind back across the country to the opposite coast. Before she was Nan Kempner, American Chic, she was Nanfield Schlesinger, a wealthy Jewish girl running through big rooms overlooking Depression-era San Francisco. Outside, hungry lines formed in front of soup kitchens. Unemployed men leaned against lampposts with empty hands. Shops pulled down their shutters one by one. Inside the Schlesinger house, the carpets were still thick, tablecloths still white, and new Ford cars still rolled out of the garage of Albert Speed Schlesinger as if the crisis were just something you heard about on the radio. Nan was born on July 24, 1930, right in the middle of America's economic storm. San Francisco did not escape the hurricane. By 1932, the national unemployment rate could reach 30%, cold numbers read out over evening broadcasts. But inside certain old money pockets of the city, life went on with balls, clubs, charity teas thick with perfume. The Schlesingers were one of those pockets. Her father, Albert Speed Schlesinger, owned SNC Motors, the largest Ford dealership in California, a business that thrived while other factories were shutting down. Her mother, Irma, was a classic society figure. She saw other people's gaze everywhere and believed a high-born woman's most important duty was never to let the world catch her off guard. Outside their windows, the city was learning hard lessons about insecurity. Inside, Nan was learning an entirely different set of lessons. She watched her parents navigate crises with phone calls and lunches rather than with panic. When markets dipped, there were tense conversations, but there was never talk of selling the house or skipping meals. That gap between the public story of the Depression and the private stability of her family planted a seed. If you had the right connections, the right name, the right assets, the storms of history could be heard but not felt. It was a comforting idea and a dangerous one. As an only child, Nan received undivided attention and the full weight of expectation from both parents. People like to say she was indulged in the most constructive way, not spoiled with candy whenever she pouted, but exposed to the finest things. Good restaurants, concerts, paintings, trips to Europe. Every new dress of Irma's, every time her mother stood in front of the mirror adjusting a brooch, every evening Nan sat on the staircase listening to grown-ups dissect who wore what to last night's party was a silent lesson. From very early on, she understood that clothes did not just announce how much money you had. They announced where you believed you belonged in the hierarchy. She was also learning, without anyone saying it out loud, that being Jewish in a largely wasp-coated social world meant walking a careful line. Money and charm opened many doors, but certain clubs, certain circles, certain phrases in polite conversation reminded you that there were invisible ceilings. Fashion in that context became another tool. The right dress, the right manner, the right lightness could smooth over origins people preferred not to mention. Then one day her father said something that shifted that careful world a few degrees off its axis. It wasn't a grand, dramatic moment. There were no guests, no bright lights, just an offhand remark from a man used to appraising women as a kind of social capital. Albert looked at his growing daughter, tall, thin, intelligent-looking, but not the sort of beauty that stops traffic, and said, "You'll never get by on your looks, so you'd better be interesting." For some girls, a line like that might have become a lifelong wound. For Nan, it became a commandment. If she wasn't beautiful enough to simply sit there, smile, and wait for the world to bring flowers, she would have to become the kind of person every table wanted to invite. Not for her face, but for her wit, her stories, her taste. From then on, behind every dress she chose, there was a parallel question. Will this make me more interesting? Beside her father's blunt realism was the smooth, constant shaping of her mother. Irma didn't just dress well. She curated herself. She knew every dress in her wardrobe, where it came from, which house made it, what voice it carried. When Nan was still small enough to sit cross-legged on the bed, Irma would unzip suitcases after trips and shake out dresses from Paris, from ateliers on Rue Cambon, Avenue Montaigne. The labels Dior, Balenciaga meant nothing to the little girl then, but the fabrics did. Sleek silk, rough tweed, soft wool, chiffon light as breath. Nan's small hands learned to recognize the weight and fall of each fabric, and somewhere in her mind a switch flipped. Couture was not just nice clothes, it was a substance, a drug. Later she would call it a lifelong addiction to haute couture. But unlike the usual addiction of a casual consumer, hers came with an awareness of history. She was not drawn to mass-produced fashion, but to unique pieces cut on individual bodies carrying the story of a season, a house, a cultural moment. In a world where clothes were often used to flaunt money, Nan had already started to see how they could signpost identity and time. Still, a girl in Depression-era San Francisco could not live on silk alone. There was school, there were manners to be learned, there was the unspoken, constantly reinforced lesson that money could protect you from almost anything, except bad taste. While neighbors worried about mortgage payments, the Schlesinger household worried about place cards and dress codes. That distance between their concerns and those of the city outside would later shape one of Nan's sharpest qualities, an almost unconscious understanding of social insulation and of the cost of maintaining it. To turn her private obsession into something more than a hobby, Nan needed language and context. Leaving San Francisco, she went east to Connecticut College to study for a Bachelor of Arts. There, among ivy-clad stone buildings and echoing lecture halls, she encountered art history, modern literature, European painting, the frameworks that would later help her talk about clothes as if they were paintings or buildings. When a Dior dress cinched a waist just so, she could feel the same post-war push toward optimism that she saw in a canvas. When a Saint Laurent suit squared a woman's shoulders, she could connect it to new ideas of female agency in the 1960s. College also offered something San Francisco never had: distance from her parents' highly choreographed world. In dorm rooms and cafeteria lines, Nan could experiment with being someone other than Irma's well-dressed daughter or Albert's interesting girl. She could test out a sharper joke, a bolder opinion, a quieter mood, and notice which versions of herself drew people in. If clothes were her first language, conversation became her second. She learned to carry a room not only by entering it in the right dress, but by knowing when to listen and when to drop a perfectly timed one-liner. It was in that collegiate world of book-lined libraries, seminars, and stiff dances that another strand of upper-class America crossed Nan's path: Thomas Lennox Kempner. Tommy came from a different but fully compatible background. A long-established German-Jewish family embedded in New York's financial and publishing worlds. If the Schlesingers represented West Coast old money, anchored in car showrooms and the wide horizons of California, the Kempners embodied East Coast old money, rooted in Wall Street offices and Manhattan townhouses. Nan and Tommy met in a setting where everything, the school, the circles they moved in, the assumptions they shared, told them they were part of the same map. To classmates, they must have looked like a near-perfect match. He, a serious young man with a future in finance. She, the witty, well-dressed girl with an eye for art and a laugh that, even then, was starting to rasp slightly from too many cigarettes at too many late-night conversations. In 1952, they married. The wedding could be read like a diagram of post-war American power. West Coast and East Coast old money joining hands, car dealerships and investment houses clinking glasses. For Nan, it was also a shift in stage. She moved from being the indulged daughter in San Francisco to being Mrs. Thomas Kempner in Manhattan. Soon there were 3 children, Lena, Thomas Jr., and James, and with them came the routines of school runs, family holidays, parent-teacher meetings layered over the older routines of fittings and parties. Marriage to Tommy gave Nan something she would never again take for granted: financial security so solid it felt almost geological. It also placed her squarely inside a structure with clear expectations. There were boards to sit on, benefits to attend, social obligations to fulfill. Nan understood that in this world a wife was both a partner and a public relations instrument. Tommy's career would benefit if his wife was presentable. It would shine if his wife became a legend. But through all of it, the addiction didn't loosen its grip. In the early 1950s, on a trip to Paris, Nan bought her first Christian Dior dress, not from a department store rack, but from the source, the Dior atelier. There, under bright lights and the quiet scrutiny of seamstresses, she stood while hands with pins and chalk circled her, marking adjustments. The resulting fitted dress, cut close to her already thin frame, did more than flatter her waist. It confirmed something she had been feeling for years: that she wasn't just a consumer of fashion, she was a participant in an art form. From that moment, she stopped seeing herself as merely an admirer and started to think of herself as part of couture's ecosystem. Not a muse in the romantic sense, perhaps, but a perfect instrument. With a height of nearly 1.75 meters and a frame almost shockingly lean, she was exactly what designers wanted: a moving, breathing hanger. Valentino would later say, with disarming honesty, "Nan always looked wonderful in my clothes because she had the body of a coat hanger." It was meant as a compliment. Nan, who had spent her life trying to be interesting, heard in it both validation and a warning. The thing the world valued most about her could be reduced to a silhouette. By the mid-1950s, Nan and Tommy had anchored themselves in New York. They chose Park Avenue as their home base, and within a few years, the Kempner penthouse, 16 rooms high above the avenue, became an address where invitations mattered. The apartment itself was a physical translation of their lives: a long dining room for formal dinners, a living room for receptions, bedrooms for the children, an office for Tommy, and then, increasingly, an expanding wing devoted entirely to Nan's clothes. In that wing, regular closets simply would not do. The collection that began with a single Dior quickly multiplied. Rails were added, then rooms. Custom-built storage appeared, shelves and racks and drawers organized not just by item but by season, by designer, by mood. Eventually, climate control systems were installed to maintain the exact temperature and humidity needed for delicate fabrics to survive New York summers and winters. Silk, wool, chiffon, organza, cashmere, and fur were kept in conditions more commonly reserved for paintings or rare books. Walking through that wardrobe was, in effect, walking through a museum of mid-century fashion. Early Dior New Look silhouettes with their cinched waists and full skirts marked the optimism of the 1950s. Later, the sharper, sleeker lines of Yves Saint Laurent signaled the leaner, more androgynous 1960s and 70s. Even among the day dresses and suits, there was a sense of curation. This jacket went with that skirt for a particular luncheon. That gown had a history with a certain charity ball. Day to day, the wardrobe was also a workplace. Nan treated it as a studio as much as a closet. She would move through the racks before an event, pulling out 2 or 3 possibilities, laying them on a bed, imagining the room they were about to enter. Who else would be there? Which other women would be in red? Would the lighting be harsh or soft, the chairs upholstered or bare? The answers determined not just which dress she chose, but which earrings, which shoes, which piece of costume jewelry borrowed from a friend or sent over on approval by a jeweler hoping to ride the reflected light of her reputation. Outside that carefully controlled climate, the air moved faster. By the 1960s, Nan Kempner was living in the rhythm journalists like to call the jet-set lifestyle. Planes replaced trains, weekends abroad replaced weekends in the country. She became known for keeping her passport in her handbag. Half joke, half policy. You never know where you'll end up. And for Nan, that was literally true. A morning might begin with breakfast on Park Avenue and end with dinner in a Parisian restaurant after a couture show. A week could take her from New York boardrooms to St. Moritz ski slopes to masked balls in Venetian palazzos. Everywhere she went, she carried the same thin, impeccably dressed figure. By the late 1960s, her wardrobe had grown into legend. It was said to contain thousands of pieces. A significant portion, 374 pieces, came from Yves Saint Laurent alone. He loved long, lean lines, sharp shoulders, and fluid trousers. On Nan's body, those shapes looked as if they belonged nowhere else. When she walked into a room in a Saint Laurent suit, it was hard to say where the garment ended and the woman began. But living as a perfect canvas required more than zipping up dresses. Behind the glamour of front-row seats and late-night suppers lay an unrelenting regime. Cigarettes taking the place of snacks, skipped meals justified with a shrug, sleep shaved off to make room for flights and fittings. The social X-ray body Tom Wolfe would immortalize in his 1987 novel The Bonfire of the Vanities did not materialize without cost. It was carved out of ordinary flesh by compromise and discipline, by the quiet terror of waking up one day and finding that a zipper no longer closed. There were inevitably moments when the mask slipped. When a friend found Nan sitting barefoot on a sofa after a fitting, a half-smoked cigarette between her fingers, admitting she was too tired to get up but too wired to sleep. When she joked about eating an entire loaf of bread and then laughed it off as an impossible fantasy. Those flashes of vulnerability rarely reached the public record, but they were part of the texture of her life. A constant negotiation between the person and the persona. In the 1970s, Nan moved from being merely a frequent presence to an emblem. She became part of the Cat Pack, a name coined by Women's Wear Daily for a set of influential New York women whose taste and social calendars shaped the city's style narrative. Her name appeared alongside those of women later famously christened swans by Truman Capote, immaculate, wealthy, cool on the surface. Rumor had it that Capote considered her too thin, too loud, too visible to be one of his icy, inscrutable birds. It was a backhanded compliment. She did not blend in enough to be cast in his particular mythology. Tom Wolfe, watching from a different angle, saw in Nan and women like her something else. Bodies pared down to their barest outlines, lives wrapped in privilege yet oddly transparent. He coined social X-ray to capture that combination of fragility and power. Women so thin they seemed almost translucent, yet capable of scanning and revealing the skeleton of the social world around them simply by being present. Nan's silhouette, with its nearly straight lines and sharp bones, became the visual shorthand for that idea. In the language people used about her, there were very few words like woman or person. Instead, there were objects, hanger, clothes horse, social X-ray, terms that treated her not as the subject of a story, but as the surface on which other stories were displayed. And yet in the spaces where she worked, Nan refused to be only a surface. Her involvement with fashion deepened beyond wearing. As a contributing editor for French Vogue, she took part in editorial meetings where images were chosen, designers were weighed against each other, themes for issues were brainstormed. She knew what it meant when a house was given 10 pages instead of 6, when a particular photograph was chosen for the opening spread. At Harper's Bazaar, as a fashion editor, she participated in building narratives around clothes. Which story went with which garments? Which model could carry that mood? Trained by years of watching and wearing, her eye was not merely decorative, it was analytical. At Christie's, where she served as an international representative, Nan shifted again, from wearing and editing to valuing. In auction rooms, she could look at a vintage Dior or YSL and see not only fabric and seams, but provenance, cultural context, rarity. A dress that someone else might dismiss as old became in her reading a document, a tangible fragment of a vanished season. Her presence in those rooms helped translate fashion from private wardrobes into collectible history. In all these roles, she was doing more than reinforcing her own image. She was quietly pushing against the idea that fashion was merely fluff. She joked with Tommy, standing amid the dense forest of her Park Avenue wardrobe. "It turns out I'm an art collector, can you imagine?" The line got a laugh, as it was meant to. But underneath the humor lay a clear, stubborn conviction. These garments were not disposable. They were artifacts worth preserving. Her conviction was echoed in a different register by Diana Vreeland, the formidable editor who had a taste for pronouncements as sharp as her eye. "There is no such thing as an elegant American woman," Vreeland once said. "The only exception is Nan Kempner." It was the line that would follow Nan for the rest of her life, a phrase quoted so often it became almost a curse. To be the only exception meant never being allowed to have an off day. No bad hair, no wrong hemline, no weight gain. From the moment that sentence hit print, every mirror was doubled. One reflected Nan as she was. The other showed her as the only proof that an elegant American woman could exist at all. Vanity Fair added its own branding iron, calling her the best-dressed clothes horse in the world. It was meant to be admiring and teasing in equal measure. Nan, who liked wordplay and understood irony, could appreciate the joke, but somewhere beyond the punchline lay a harder truth. Entire magazines, entire social narratives were most comfortable talking about her as an exquisite animal, a perfect rack, a thing. To live with that kind of label required more than a high pain tolerance. It required an agile sense of self. In public, Nan leaned into the role. She attended shows season after season. Over 55 years, she missed only one fashion season. Taking notes with her eyes, applauding innovations, recognizing quotations from past collections. She let herself be photographed, let her outfits be cataloged and copied. In private, she clung to the parts of her life that did not photograph easily. Long conversations, in-jokes with friends, small acts of kindness. Those acts scaled up when she turned her social skills toward philanthropy. For more than 3 decades, Nan devoted time and energy to Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. She chaired committees, hosted gala dinners, worked phone lines, and coaxed checks from people who were used to being on the receiving end of flattery. not the giving end of large sums. Under the chandeliers and soft lighting of her dinners, couture gowns moved through the room carrying pledge cards and seating charts alongside perfume. By the time she was done, she had helped raise more than $75 million for the hospital. The numbers themselves are impressive. The mechanism behind them is perhaps more interesting. Nan understood that people of her world would more readily part with money if they felt they were buying an experience as well as doing good. She constructed those experiences with the same care she used on an outfit, considering every detail so no one would notice the hard work beneath. At one such gala, guests might have walked into a ballroom washed in a particular shade of light, chosen to flatter both skin and silk. Tables would be set so that no one powerful was stranded, no one shy was overwhelmed. The menu would be indulgent but not heavy. The music present but not deafening. Somewhere near the middle of the evening there would be a short speech about research and survival rates, just long enough to pierce the protective bubble of comfort, not so long as to make anyone shift in their chairs. Then the auctions, the pledges, the quiet calculations of tax deductions wrapped in applause. By the time the last guest left, they would remember a beautiful night. Nan would remember the figure at the bottom of the pledge sheet. In 2000, she published RSVP, Menus for Entertaining, a cookbook that doubled as a manual for building evenings. The recipes were interwoven with suggestions about table settings, guest lists, pacing, all the invisible architecture that makes a dinner feel effortless. Every cent from the book went to charity. Again, she turned the very thing people mocked, the socialite obsession with parties and presentation, into a funding stream for something deadly serious. Yet while she was organizing help for others' bodies, her own was weakening. Years of smoking, the cigarette so often an extension of her hand and a prop for her laugh, finally took their toll. Emphysema, a chronic lung disease, began to erode her stamina. The woman who had once flown across the Atlantic as casually as others crossed a street found herself counting the steps from bedroom to living room. At the age when many allow themselves to soften, gain a little weight, surrender to comfort, Nan remained trapped inside the silhouette the world had celebrated. To be the only exception was to feel that you could not change shape without letting down an entire mythology. She kept slipping into old Saint Laurent suits and Dior gowns, feeling the fabric hug a body that no longer recovered from late nights as quickly. Every event became a small logistical operation. Where to sit so she could excuse herself if the breathing became too hard. How to phrase a quip so she could hide a gasp for air in the pause. The social X-ray, once a metaphor, became almost literal. Her lungs, scarred by decades of smoke, struggled to inflate fully. Each breath felt like a limited resource. The woman who had walked through rooms as if she weighed nothing now had to negotiate with gravity, with oxygen, with fatigue. On some evenings, just crossing the threshold from her wardrobe into the party felt like walking onto a runway for the last time. Those closest to her saw the change before the public did. They noticed how she would sink into a chair with a small sigh after making it across a room, how her laugh came in shorter bursts, how she paused at the top of a flight of stairs as if admiring the view when she was really stealing a moment to breathe. She still cared about hemlines and jewelry, but the stakes had shifted. The question was no longer only, does this look right? But can I bear this weight for 3 hours without collapsing? On July 3, 2005, at 74, that runway ended. Nan Kempner died, leaving behind a Park Avenue apartment whose closets were fuller than the lungs that had carried them for half a century. Obituaries did what obituaries do, they summarized. They noted she was born in 1930 in San Francisco, the daughter of Albert and Irma Schlesinger. That she married banker Thomas Lennox Kempner in 1952. That they had 3 children. They listed her affiliations: client and friend of Dior, Yves Saint Laurent, Valentino, contributing editor to French Vogue, fashion editor for Harper's Bazaar, international representative for Christie's, indefatigable fundraiser for Memorial Sloan Kettering. And they repeated again the words of others. Vreeland's only exception, Vanity Fair's clothes horse, Wolf's social X-ray. A year later, in December 2006, the Metropolitan Museum of Art opened Nan Kempner American Chic. In the quiet, climate-controlled galleries, more than 70 outfits from her vast wardrobe stood on mannequins. Dior, Saint Laurent, Valentino, and others lined up in chronological and thematic order. Visitors traced decades by following hemlines and shoulder shapes. The full skirts of the 1950s, the sharp suits of the 1960s, the languid drapes of the 1970s. Each mannequin bore a small plaque with information. Designer, year, occasion. Some mentioned that Nan wore this gown to such and such ball, that suit to a certain opening. None mentioned the time she had to sit down halfway through a hallway because her lungs burned, or the way she would joke about hiding an oxygen tank behind a couture skirt if it ever came to that. Museums are not built to explain the bodily cost of beauty. They are built to show what remains once the body is gone. In a sense, that was exactly what Nan had wanted. She had always treated her wardrobe as an archive, not just a closet. Her family's decision to donate much of it to the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco, FAMSF, completed a loop. The clothes that had traveled the world came home to the city where a little girl had first learned to recognize silk by touch. Stored there, cataloged and conserved, they became part of a different kind of narrative. The story of American chic seen through one woman's choices. And somewhere else, on a wall with flat light, Andy Warhol's 1973 portrait of Nan looked back. Silk-screened and stylized, it showed a face divided into zones of color, lips slightly parted, eyes half amused, half appraising. Warhol's Nan was all surface, which for him was the point. If you want to know all about Andy Warhol, he once said of himself, just look at the surface of my paintings. And there I am. A similar logic could be applied to the way the world chose to know Nan. Look at the surface, the clothes, the silhouette, the poses, and say you have seen enough. But underneath that surface was a more complicated figure. A child of the Great Depression who never personally went without, yet grew up with the knowledge that her security was not universal. A daughter told she would have to be interesting to matter, who then spent decades being spoken of as if her primary value lay in how well she wore other people's creations. A woman who turned the tools of her environment, gowns, dinners, the performance of elegance, into a way of funding cancer research even as her own lungs silently failed. Seen that way, Nan Kempner's life reads less like a fairy tale of endless dresses and more like a case study in what a certain kind of society demands from the women who symbolize it. She was celebrated as an ideal and used as an instrument. Her body was shaped to meet the needs of designers, photographers, editors, hosts, and donors. Even after death, her clothes went on working, teaching fashion students, attracting museum members, filling catalogs. If fashion is often dismissed as a game of surfaces, her story insists that surfaces have histories. A Dior hemline can tell you about post-war prosperity. A Saint Laurent jacket can whisper about shifting gender roles. A Valentino gown can testify to the economics of luxury. On Nan's body, these histories were layered one over another until they formed a kind of armor. Beautiful, yes, but also heavy. Decades after her death, someone will stand in front of one of her dresses in a museum. They may think only, how beautiful. They may tilt their head, read the plaque, note the designer, the year, the occasion. They may take a photo and share it with a caption about timeless style. All of that is natural. It is what museums are built for. Most visitors will not know, and do not need to know, that the woman whose name is on the plaque once sat at a dressing table wondering if she could get through another night in heels without her lungs seizing. They are not required to picture her at 14, running her hands over her mother's dresses. At 30, standing in a Dior fitting room. At 50, counting donations after a gala. At 70, timing her sentences to her breath. Museums offer conclusions, not processes. The mannequins are there to erase the mess of life, to pin the story into one clean backlit frame. Yet every now and then someone standing in that soft light might feel a faint unease, a sense that there is more story here than any label can hold. They might notice the way the fabric falls and imagine a real shoulder underneath, tensing, relaxing, carrying trays, shaking hands. They might think of their own clothes hanging in cramped wardrobes at home, the compromises and costs stitched into those seams, and realize that even the most dazzling garment is still only fabric until a body moves inside it. But somewhere between the mannequin and the viewer, an unanswered question hangs in the air. The same one that hovered over Nan's life from the moment Vreeland anointed her the only exception. When a culture builds monuments to clothes, who builds a monument to the body that carried them? And if that body belonged to a woman taught from childhood that her highest calling was to be both beautiful and useful, then what, in the end, was Nan Kempner? A triumph of American chic, or one of its most finely dressed casualties?